Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Primates Discover the Printing Press. And so the printing press is often pointed to as one of the turning points in world civilization, and for very good reason. But I would argue, if you look at the history of the printing press and what people talk about, there's all kinds of aspects of it. But I think what I want to emphasize, is too little appreciated. So along with all of the other material that we'll talk about, I do want to talk about this from the perspective, again, of course, of the primate and what the printing press does that is unique for the primates and how the primates interact with the world and why this changes not just a little bit, but fundamental relationships that have been grounded in the human condition since we were primates. This, I would argue, is the beginning of the true breakdown of some of these core aspects of primate society that at a very late date, so we're talking about the 1400s here, mid-1400s, so 15th century roughly, when the printing press really gets going, that core elements of primate society and civilization that have survived up to that point begin to break down. And I will also argue at the end of this, sort of spoiler alert for the end, stay tuned for these exciting insights, if you want to call them that what we're experiencing today, one of the reasons that we find the world so confusing and off-putting at times, in part is due to we are leaving, a literate society. The printing press no longer functions. Of course, we still are literate, and we still have print and print society and print culture, but it's no longer the dominant cultural mode. And we'll talk about why that's so important. But to understand that, we need to go back and talk about the history of literacy and writing and what the printing press changes. So, of course, writing goes way back, as we talked about before. And so we've had literacy and literate people for thousands of years. However, this was always a very, very minority pursuit, because most of these ancient languages, as written, were incredibly complicated and difficult. And this was not an accident. It's, if you're a scribe, how do you make sure that your job is valuable, important, and hard to replace? You make it really difficult to learn your language. So this makes scribes incredibly valuable, because learning a scribal language becomes quite difficult, and many of these languages are vastly more complicated. In fact, even in the last 200 years, German, French, English, Chinese, I don't know about Japanese. I should check this. I don't know off the top of my head. But they've gone through either one or many waves of simplification, rationalization, as they call it, to try and make these languages that evolved under conditions not at all like the modern world more amenable to mass education, general literacy, and in fact, that culture is working against the scribal culture and the scribal tradition that goes back thousands of years. So the onset of the printing press, as we'll see, is not a small shift. It really is this dramatic challenge to the nature of and uses of literacy that had been with us for thousands of years. So you get to the mid-1400s here, 1450s, 1460s, 1470s, and it's not a printing press is, of course, not one thing. The Chinese had a version of this. The Japanese had a version of this. Wood block print. All of this had been around. And this is where people keep focusing on the technology, and the technology is necessary, but it has to be within a social and cultural context that makes the technology kind of boom. And that's what you get when you get the Gutenberg press, which spreads rapidly across Europe, and you get this just, thousands and thousands of books being printed, where before the books were printed in the hundreds. And then within a few decades, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of books being printed, which would be every year more books were printed than had been produced in Europe for, a century. It was an exponential growth. It was like vertical line growth in the production of books. Why? And what does this mean? And what had to happen for this to come about? And why did it happen in Europe, say, and not so much in China and other countries that had developed, like, again, the classic example is the block print, where you print a page from a sacred book or something else, or a announcement from the king or the emperor, and then you promulgate that. And it's like, okay, people had that, but it didn't ever quite take off. And there's a number of reasons for this, but what's important when you get to the 15th century is, one, metal. As I talked about last time, iron changes a lot. Hello. And when you get metal, this means that you can have a printing press that lasts a long time. So you can do a lot of deep impressions, and you can do them for days, weeks, 100, 200, 500, 1,000 times. So that's a big one. 2 is alphabets. Now, alphabets are a great simplification, because there's only, you have some punctuation, although punctuation, well, we leave aside the whole evolution of punctuation and spacing and all that, because that's a whole another lecture in itself. But you have, 26 letters, or, give or take some, 32, some accent goos, some umlauts, whatever. So you have 26, 30, 40 letters. This is not very many. This is a very small set compared to hundreds and hundreds of symbols that you need. For instance, if you're going to do Chinese or, other languages that have massive requirements of the amount of different basic units you would need, little blocks you would need to construct a page. So, to do an English language text or a German language or an alphabet, Latin, it doesn't matter. If it uses the alphabet, well, then you're only using, 26 letters, basically. And you're using them over and over and over again. And so this makes it very easy. It makes it quick to compose a page. You print it out. You're not throwing any away. When you do a block cut, you're making, one, it takes a long time to cut a full page of Chinese onto a piece of wood, and then you only print so many times because wood isn't that great. Now, trying to inscribe that into metal was done and can be done, but wow, it's really a challenge, right? And so alphabets just work better in this case for the printing press. So it's kind of a co-evolve. We have the alphabet, so it helps the printing press evolve. You also get, again, the metal, which makes it last. It's easy to create the alphabets and have all the letters stored. You have ink technology. You have the evolution of paper. So before you have paper, you're using things like vellum, which is incredibly expensive, or other different things that you can use. But rag paper or wood pulp paper just is a factor cheaper, like 100 times. Like one page of vellum is way more expensive than 100 pages of paper. And so you have this whole series of interrelated technologies that kind of co-evolve and feedback at each other. And then one day you get the printing press. And the printing press meets something else that's been happening, which is a growing group of literate people. And one reason you get this expanding group of literate people, particularly in Europe, is you have a whole bunch of competing political and religious institutions. So you have the Catholic Church pretty much everywhere, but you have lots of different centers of Catholic powers. The cardinals and bishops and stuff are at different places. They have their own staff who are helping to administrate things. And then you have all the dukedoms and the kingdoms and the counts who have, countless hundreds, if not thousands, of different principalities and religious sects. You have free cities. And those cities some of them have universities now. So then you have free cities with universities, and you have religious scholars, and you have all of these things. So you have this both growing competition and growing collection of literate people, because every duke basically needs to have a couple of secretaries, somebody to do the accounts, somebody to do the books. They become literate, probably, not invariably, but probably they become at least a little bit literate. Then they have their staff and then their families. And then you have you literally hundreds of these principalities and dukedoms just in what became Germany. Right, the unification of Germany was a slow process of agglomerating all these hundreds and hundreds of little principalities into one big administrative unit. So before you had this just vast collection of administrative units, each of which had their own little secretariats who were all writing to each other. And this started this feedback loop, in part, not the only thing, but in part, of literacy. So you have increasing numbers of secretaries. You need to train them. Legal things become more important. And then this collection of people who have access to books, access to education, want more of this, are communicating. You start getting the ability to pass letters around. You get the Renaissance with its emphasis on education. And then, boom, you get the printing press. And the printing press does this magic trick. What it does is it allows you to reproduce a whole bunch of copies of one thing and then distribute them fairly efficiently. And this isn't just books. We always think of books, and books are hugely important. And there's, like I said, massive amounts of books produced, but also like single sheet, flyers equivalent of like basically like a Xerox machine. Like they're like, okay, we're going to print up this page, and this page is going to say things like, nah, we don't like the Duke, he's doing a crap job. Or I'm Luther, and I think that the Catholic Church has got some problems that it really, really needs to address. Now I can make not 10 copies, not 100 copies that have to be written out by hand, but I can make 10,000. Now, again, these numbers, it doesn't go from 5 or 10. Think about how many hand copies you can make, how many handwritten copies. And indeed, back before the printing press, and even after the printing press for a while, people used to hand copy books because that was the only way you could afford to get them. So you'd either copy the whole book, or you would copy the part of the book that was most appealing to you. And then you would have this collection of books, which were either hand-copied books that you had done or sort of selections from the key works that you liked. And then your friends would borrow those and go, oh, okay, you really like these sections from Aristotle. Oh, I like these other sections of Aristotle. And so another friend would say, oh, my two friends have sections of Aristotle. I'm going to borrow both of those and create a fuller version of Aristotle. Plus I have access to this other section of Aristotle. And so people were hand copying and sharing, which is great, but not that efficient in one way. All of a sudden, now you cannot make one copy of Aristotle or 2 copies of Aristotle or 5 copies of Aristotle. Think if you have a scriptorium, even if you're not doing a crap job, forget all these beautiful illustrated ones that they did. But even if you have a scriptorium and someone works pretty diligently doing a decent job, it's going to take you, maybe you could do 2 Aristotle collections a year, maybe per person. So if you have 20 monks working, you can maybe get, say, 40 or 50 copies of one work out in a year with 20 monks working full time. So this is just like ridiculous. Now, a couple of guys with a printing press can set that and print out 1,000 copies in a month or more. Like, it's not a problem. And so the acceleration is not from 5 to 10 or from 10 to 20. It's not that doubling or even tripling or even quadrupling. Oh, now we can do 40 where we only used to be able to do 6. It's, we used to be able to do 6, and now we can do 6,000, right? It was like, wow, we can really, really do this. And that's spectacular. And so it started this fundamental shift in how we relate to the world and how we conceptualize the world. And this is the part that I think people underappreciate. And I think one of the reasons, again, that we get confused about where we are today is because we're moving away from this. So let's go back again. So if you look at something like, Plato, so in the Phaedrus, Socratic dialogue, the Phaedrus, one thing that Socrates talks about is how much we shouldn't trust writing. Because something that's written down, and if you read this, I love this, it's one of my favorite dialogues, maybe my favorite one. If you read it, what you realize is what he says in there, and the character Phaedrus has been tricked by a speech by somebody else. And Socrates says, look, you can't trust the written word because you can't cross-examine the author. And it's the character and intent and heart and worth and value of the author that really matters, right? This is what we're worried about. This is what we care about. We need this contact with the person so that even if the sentence isn't coming out right or we misunderstand it a little bit, we can still understand the intent and purpose of them, and we can judge the merits of the person, and hence we can judge the merits of the work. And so he's wildly suspicious of writing because what it does is it puts something between us. It's supposed to represent what the person wants to say, but I can't know why they're saying it. Why did they construct the argument this way? Should I trust this argument? Are they misleading me in some way? Are they using it for purposes I don't appreciate? What we would call propaganda, right? Oh, they've written this thing that sounds convincing, but do they mean it or are they trying to mislead me? How do I know? Can I just tell from the text? Don't I need to cross-examine them? Don't I need to know the nature of their character so I can understand better what they've written? And this is a perfectly reasonable argument, of course, particularly now that we live in a world of propaganda. We understand the problem with this. But it doesn't matter because we're the children of literacy. And so even though we know that on one level, we act as if we don't on another level, because we just believe in the word. And so as literacy expands, as literacy grows, and now we're talking about over, a couple of, let's see exactly what would that be. So 300 plus 14, so 1,800 years later, we get the printing press. But literacy has been growing and expanding over that time period, and this problem is getting worse and worse because we're dealing with more text from more people who are further away. So we have less chance to question them, we have less chance to know about them, and we're more stuck with the text. And then one day, you get the printing press. And now, not that this wasn't already a bit of a problem, but this problem becomes massive because between you and the person who is creating the text, there is now a mechanical device. And the texts are being created in a way that makes the printing press happy and the structure of printing happy. And now I have no recourse, right? Not only has the person maybe been dead for 1,000 years, whose text I'm trying to read, but even if the person is alive, there is this mechanical reproduction between us. And if you send out 10,000 copies or 100,000 copies, of 100,000 would take a long time to get to that number, but 10,000 was achieved pretty quickly. You're now there is this complete disjuncture, and we're so used to this notion. We're so used to the one-to-many distribution model that it doesn't really cause us to pause, but if I was trying to think of examples of how much of a change this was for people historically. If you were the child of an aristocrat, particularly a male child, but also female children of aristocrats, because they were often very important people as well. So not gender equality by any stretch of the imagination, but often, particularly relative to their societies, much more power, much more authority, much more importance invested in them. Two of the most important teachers that you would have would be elocution and your dance instructor. Why? Why were these so vital? Because we're primates, and this is where the primates parts of this come in. What did we talk about from the beginning with the primates? Vocalization and physical demonstration, like the making faces and waving your arms and pounding your chest. All of this is fundamental to how primate societies are formed and maintain themselves. If you look at aristocratic education all over Europe, by the way, also in parts of China, depending how you read this, and other places as well, but particularly in Europe, you can see this quite clearly. What you emphasized was functionally deportment and speech and self-presentation and dance. So dance wasn't about dancing to music, although that was part of it too. Dance was how you moved, how you picked up a piece of paper, how you greeted someone, how you walked down a corridor. All of these things were designed so that when you met somebody, they knew your character, they knew who you were. They could recognize that you were part of the tribe, that you were this important person, that you mattered, that you had the right kind of education. And so they were educating their children for a world of personal interaction. You're going to be in the presence of people. This is what matters. You're in a tribe, you're in a group, you're in you've got your territory in the forest, and you and your tribe, your monkey group, your primates are all there vocalizing and making movements at each other. And this is how primate society works. Excuse me. And now, fast forward, whatever we are at this point, evolutionarily, a million years or something, This is still the core of an aristocratic education because that is how you communicated to the other members of your tribe. You did it with vocalizations and you did it with physical movements until you get mass literacy and mass distribution of print. That is the wedge that really begins to undermine that. Because for the first time in human history, now, again, this predates the printing press a little bit, but the printing press really accelerates this. So when you get the printing press and you get the bureaucracy that goes with the printing press and you get the expanded literacy that makes the printing press valuable, right? These all, chicken and egg thing, these all influence each other and feed back into each other. What happens? You get a new aristocracy in France. They called it the aristocracy of the gown. Other places had other words for it. But basically what it meant was the aristocracy of the literate people, the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, the secretaries, were just to manage and control and understand and communicate across increasingly large societies with increasingly complex economies and political situations and, plans and all this required this sort of literacy. But this literacy was not of person to person. It was text to text. And of course, this is a slow change. It doesn't happen overnight. But you actually get a new type of aristocracy. You're not born to it and educated into it, but you, as far as like, my parents were dukes, they trained me to dance and speak well, and then I went off to court, and I was impressive in court, and so, hey, presto, my career is made. No, this was I'm probably, middle class. Somehow I was able to get an education, often through the church. Now I'm literate. My literacy gets recognized. I'm a really brilliant person, and hey, presto, I'm valuable at the court. But I'm not valuable in the way that an aristocrat was valuable of old. I'm valuable because of all of this bureaucracy that requires paperwork to speak to paperwork. Right? This removal, it's not the individual that matters as much. It is the material, it is the mechanical reproduction between the individuals that matter. And that transformation has just spectacular impacts on every aspect of our lives, to the point that we've almost forgotten that that our lives are structured this way. I think we're only remembering in part because it's beginning to fall apart. But again, we'll get to that at the end. So what do I mean by this? Well, again, up until this time, almost everybody was doing almost all of their communications with people that they saw and who saw them, right? The last maybe great fluorescence of this was probably Versailles, where the king realized like the best way to control the aristocrats is to just make them all go one place and spend all their money there and time there, so that you could keep an eye on them and their resources are around, and so they're less of a threat to you. And so the court, and being present at court and being the kind of person who you want to be present at court, and all of the social and communal aspects of everybody being together, and right, this is just a primate tribe. This is just a primate tribe with the king up there, trying to keep all the other monkeys in line, and they're all vocalizing and dancing and doing what primates have done forever, and that works. It still worked. It still worked great. But increasingly, the power of the lawyer who is taking a case and writing a letter to a court that's a long ways away, and maybe you send somebody to appear in court. Notice you still have to appear in court, but that's somebody else. And so that these distances, these abstractions start to grow and grow and grow. And so the immediacy and the belief in the immediacy begins to dissolve. And that is perhaps the greatest transformation of all, more than iron, more than cities, more than literacy itself. Because up until you get to this point, most people, almost all of the time, are in a world of face-to-face. It is now, and it is physical, and it is present. And with the advent of the printing press and with the advent of mass literacy, all of a sudden, think about what's happening. And Now people are reading Aristotle from 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. Wow, like I'm communicating with ideas from another time, from another culture, from another like entirely different religious perspective. And not just a few people, not just a couple of dozen educated religious figures or philosophers. No, hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of people. This has an impact. Like this really starts to transform people. You get the evolution very quickly of the novel. And what the novel is the capacity, again, we've talked about this before with the primates. The primates have the ability to imagine the world not as it is. And now this technology comes along that allows you by yourself to sit quietly, although group reading was still very popular for a long time, by the way. So you'd have one literate person who would read out loud. But now you begin to evolve this capacity, if you want, to sit by yourself and imbibe imaginary worlds and imaginary concepts. And that is both dangerous, right? Unstable, destabilizing. And it's destabilizing both the governments, of course, as I mentioned when we talked about literacy before, now they really, really start getting concerned about printing presses. So as soon as you get the printing press, you start getting rules about smashing printing presses. And the censorship wars are on instantaneously because the first things that people decide to write are, hey, the king really sucks, and sex novels, like the first erotica and then political tracts. This is what started being printed like so fast. It's amazing. And so when Luther is nailing his theses to the wall, this is exemplary. Like the notion that, hey, we've got this new technology, what should we do with it? Complain about, rail against, shout at, try and change the world in which we live. This is not a side impact. This is what this technology does because it's an amplifier of the primate capacity to imagine the world. But now we can imagine the world and we can communicate and have contact with hundreds or thousands of other people who have imagined the world as being different from the world is. And now we can have these totally speculative imaginary worlds. We can have comedic worlds and hilarious worlds and all of this all in our own minds. And so it's almost hard to even conceptualize how important this is because it blows apart the immediate physicality of the world and replaces it both in very real senses, like I mentioned politically, like courts give way to legal proceedings and accountancy and all of this stuff that abstracts it and puts it at distance. And it's not about the individual. It's about the process or the paperwork being filed or the ledgers being balanced or, it's all that abstraction that we're completely used to is really, really new. I mean, like shockingly new. Because even if you score it from the 15th century, still most people aren't literate. 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, still, it takes a long time for literacy to become generalized. But that process of generalizing literacy is itself like incredibly revolutionary, as, literally revolutionary, in which people point out like, yeah, this is one of the influences on things like, the Reformation and the French Revolution and all kinds of political unrest that happens all over the world in Europe and everywhere else is tied directly to and not incidentally to rises in literacy, distribution of printed material, etc. And so that impact is dramatic and overwhelming, but it partly is because it denatures the world, and in the sense that it removes the immediacy of individuals vocalizing and, demonstrating to each other in very direct physical ways. And it substitutes abstraction, mechanical reproduction, and imagination, all of which were capacities that are inherent in primates, as we've talked about. But the mechanical reproduction aspect of it just amplifies it. And the literacy expands it to the point where it's breathtaking, but we've forgotten how breathtaking this is. That I can sit and read, as I tend to do, philosophers who've been dead for 100 or 1,000 or 2,000 years, and feel as if I'm communicating with someone else and their ideas. Like, people talk about science fiction and people coming from the future or communicating with the past. And it's like, no, we do this, or at least we have the sense that we do it. I mean, it's an extraordinary, almost superpower that has evolved and developed, but that, again, denatures the world from where our primate ancestors were, but not just our primate ancestors, our 15th century ancestors, our 16th century ancestors, our 17th century ancestors, right? That notion of immediacy, that notion of direct communication gives way to abstraction and mechanical reproduction that intervenes. And then that gap is filled by a human imagination. And so it's the cultivation and reinforcing of that extraordinary power of the human imagination at just wow, now we're running. And people go, look at the explosion. You start rolling out the Renaissance, you get the Enlightenment, you get all of this change so quickly, and all of these bright minds are sparking. And it's like, yes, it's not because there was suddenly a collection of remarkably brilliant people. It's because that capacity of brilliance now had the medium and the social setting and the technology behind it that allowed it to be cultivated and expressed and expanded and amplified. And it's like, wow, boom, here we are. And so we're in larger cities with way more primates around us, and we don't know how to deal with that. It creates problems. And now we take that further and go, we're going to amplify that and put ourselves in touch with people all over the world and all throughout time. And then we're going to cultivate our imaginative capacity and create artificial, imagined utopic futures, which become science fiction at some point, depending on when you want to score the earliest science fiction works. It takes a while, but not too long. But utopias definitely come out immediately when we imagine alternative societies that could be run better, could be run perfectly, could make human life so great. And so, wow, it's just again, it's not a 1 time or a 2x or a 3x. It's this just dimensional expansion of the primate imagination writ large and permeates all of society, to the point that where you evolve as you get increasingly literate, that you now begin to distrust people. Right? So if you swear to something, you say, oh, I swear it. There's no, you have to go in and get a notary and you have to sign a piece of paper. Now it's real, right? Just saying, oh no, if you're going to give, if you see a crime or something, the police are going to say, okay, I'm going to write this down. I'm going to take a whatever document, and then you're going to sign it and I'm going to sign it. And it's the signing of the paper that makes your words and your experience valid. No signatures, no paper. Basically, we don't trust you. You don't count. Which, again, as recently as 1700s, even 1800s, the ruling class, the aristocracies, are being educated specifically to speak well and move well, because that's what made you believable. The way you spoke and the way you moved. This and the way you dressed, your deportment, these things were what made you believe. Just like in primate society, right? We knew you because we had heard you vocalize, we've seen you, we've watched you move, we've seen what you do, we know you're a good monkey. You're the kind of primate that we like, you're a primate of our tribe. Excellent. Now, to be a primate of our tribe, you have to have a signature and a piece of paper. And if you're in France, you also have to have stamps. They love to have the stamps on the pieces of paper. It's amazing. So that's what makes it real. We're no longer real in ourselves, to the point where, of course, and now we're just used to it, everybody carries identity cards, because you're not you unless you have a piece of paper that says you are you, right? We're so used to that we no longer remark on how it is that we get to be us. Well, we get to be us because we have identity cards that tell us that we are us. Because if you don't have those identity cards, I assure you, you're not you. And the amount of energy and effort that's put into things like visas and driver's license and other kinds of civic identity is huge, because otherwise we don't know you're a person. We don't know who you are. And you can't say like, oh, I'm a primate, I'm a member of this tribe. People are like, I need a piece of paper and I need a signature and I need some other signatures from some other pieces of paper. Otherwise, I don't know who you are. Even though you're here, even though you have a physical presence. So it's been abstracted to the point where even our existence and our speaking and our doing all the right primate things no longer verifies us as being primates, basically. It no longer allows us to be in existence. It's really literally the paperwork. That's the stuff that makes us go. And that transition has been profound, let us say, like absolutely training and disorienting and like undercutting the primate to a phenomenal degree. And so, and by the way, I'm entirely pro-literacy. This is a funny thing. I mean, I live in books. I live in written language. But we have to recognize, which we don't anymore. I think we've forgotten that this language mediation and this use of mechanical reproduction to communicate the world to us has come at the great expense of our primate nature, which is to physically see, to physically hear, to feel, to touch. It's Socrates saying, I don't trust writing because I can't talk to it. I can't cross-examine it. I don't know what's in its heart. That's very primate. This is, substantially primate. It's with the printing press and, all of its associated spread of literacy and bureaucracy and all of this that, again, are a feedback loop. So it's not, the printing press causes this. It's part of the nascent core of this, makes it possible. That expands one capacity of the primate. But what's happened is we've run so far with that and we're so used to it that we've forgotten that, until a few hundred years ago, which now, again, a few hundred years ago, we've had cities and civilization and literacy for thousands of years. So a few thousand years and then a few hundred years ago, say 200, maybe general literacy, general spread of print culture, general spread of legal and bureaucratic systems dedicated to this kind of thing, that they become ubiquitous. Now we've displaced thousands of years of cultural evolution and millions of years of human evolution and species evolution with a technological transformation that takes our primate imaginations and just ramifies them into every aspect of our life, but then distills out and de-emphasizes, which may be necessary when we're in such vast communes of life, that individual interaction on which our societies and our understanding of the world is still necessarily built, which, again, we just forget. We forget that it not only wasn't that way, but it still in a way isn't that way, because we really do still like people. We still like the face-to-face. We still need it desperately to be healthy. Which brings us to today, because one of the things that's clearly happening in the world, although it's been commented on, but not within the context of print culture and literacy generally, is this is being overwhelmed now by basically the culture of images and the culture of the telepresence, as people, that's a kind of an old phrase today, but I do like it. It's this remote presence thing. So if anybody's ever been on a Zoom call, you realize that it's a meeting, you can see the people, but somehow it's evil and exhausting. Everybody talks about this. Isn't some insight by me. Everybody knows this. Why? Well, because it's an illusory and unsatisfying primate experience. Sending an email, what you would think would be less good, but somehow it feels better than sitting having 6 people on a call and trying to do, and it's just you could feel your life ebbing away. And it's because there's this crazy gap between the primate going, oh, great, I can see people, and then going, but it's not working. So it's triggering all kinds of my primate vocalizations and my attempts to smile and to communicate, and it doesn't feel like it's happening. And so I'm just getting sadder as it goes along. This is the problem of telepresence. And we're now so inundated with images, particularly moving images and sound, that we're in this bizarre never land where we've passed through the literacy phase. We've passed through when the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Only literate primates could come up with that concept. This is not what most primates and their gods were about for many millennia. It's the literate primates who tried to argue that it was the Word that was God, because that's the primates of the book. Right now, your God is associated with a book. Only really literate people ever think things like this. It's almost bizarre to conceptualize, right? That you would feel this way. Icons that exist before images, carvings, trees, all that makes sense. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Wow! Now we're talking to literate people. But now that is going away. The primacy of literacy, the mediation of language, is giving away to the mediation of images. Again, this is nothing original with me. This is well documented. In fact, I just talked about Baudrillard the other day. This is definitely Baudrillard territory, and many other people. But what's not remarked so much is that it displaces literacy with something different and new. And so not only do we have a weak understanding of how literacy has transformed our society and our experience of the world, because we just take it for granted and we assume, oh, we've been literate primates for a long time. Not true. And these forms of existence and communication have been standard. Not true. And this is the only way you can do society and it all makes sense. Not true. And so as it begins to break down, we're just continuously shocked when people say things like, oh, it's the medium is the message. That's one of the great catchphrases from a couple of decades ago, and yet it captures that sense. Like, oh, you think all the words matter? No, the words don't matter. My favorite, or one of my great examples here, is watch any commercial that includes for pharmaceuticals, because what they do is they say, oh, hey, do you have whatever? Do your earlobes, wiggle in the wind, or some bizarre thing that they create that's probably not really that much of a problem. And then they say, oh, this will make it great. This will win. Then they have to go, by law in the United States at least, I don't know about other countries, they have to tell you all the side effects. And the side effects are always this list of things like, oh, your children will explode spontaneously, the sun will go dark, civilization will end, all the fish in the sea will die, right? And it's just like, and they have to read that. So what they do is they read that, but they show you images of like puppies in a field and happy people on dates and, fishing in the pond and all these things. And it turns out it doesn't matter what you say. As the people say, your heart will stop, all the money will be drained from your bank account, and, your dog will bite you if you take these pills. If you show a happy picture of a couple walking on a beach, they think, oh, good, I want to take those pills. Because the medium, the images, the structure of how things are presented is very, very powerful, and often, not invariably, but often overwhelms what you would think would be important. And so as literate text-based people who've been trained up to believe in this sort of structural element of the truth of textuality, like the notion of being universally suspicious of textuality is hard to imagine. And then the fact that it might be displaced by this new God, this God of the moving image, the God of telepresence, we just find it endlessly baffling, even while it's taking place. Even while those old forms that we're so enmeshed in are dissolving and rapidly fading into the sunset. And so we're at this second transition phase. And again, this is not original with me anyway, where we used to believe in language, we used to believe in books, we used to believe in authorship, we used to believe in all this stuff. And now we basically communally are like, it's nice and all that, but maybe AI writes the book. Or what we really like are TV shows and movies and images and TikTok shorts and all of these moving pictures. They're very much more pleasing to the monkeys, but they create a culture and a social outlook and an understanding of the world that is fundamentally and profoundly different. And right now we're living through that transition, whether we like it or not, whether it's a good idea or not. We can talk about that a lot. But it's certainly going on, and it's kind of driving the primates mad, because it's a different It's a very different, again, evolution culturally and how we understand and interact with the world and how we sense it. And so this is the power of the printing press. This is what we've experienced. It's so trained us, it's so acculturated us, and so pervaded every aspect of primate society that we lose track that it's even happened. We just take it all for granted, even though, again, the impact, it's 500 years ago that the thing is invented, and it's 250 years ago at most, I think that would be an exaggeration, that you really have widespread literacy and the processes and cultural forms that widespread literacy make possible and necessary become dominant, become assumed, become necessary, so that just wow. And then right when we get used to it, right when about 150 or 200 years of civilization have evolved under those conditions, we start changing it again. And now we're like, oh, God, no, what's wrong? This can't be. This doesn't work. This can't be right. It feels so wrong and feels so unnatural because, again, we're transitioning out of that old form into something else, the form of telepresence or whatever else you want to call this media world in which our primates are now saturated. But, again, it's not the world of the literate and of the press and of the sense of communicating with another individual who has a voice across time and space within our own imaginations. That dynamic is being collapsed. But it was opened up, and it was there for several hundred years in increasing quantities and ratios, of course, as literacy spreads. And the impact of dramatically expanding the imagination and the imaginative space of the primates was quite literally and repeatedly revolutionary. It changed our political systems, our scientific systems, our global outlook. Like, it just changed so much about human culture because it just made the imagination of the individual and the communications of individuals so utterly and completely different than it ever had been in history. And I'll leave with a final example of this. It's very clear. So if you look at the charts, as I mentioned before, I think I try to find outside verification for things. And one of the things you can look at is the growth patterns of human population throughout history. As I mentioned, when you get iron and metalwork begins to spread, you do see this first jump in the growth rate of human population. And then that just kind of chugs along pretty steady. Then you get the Black Death, which was a sort of global phenomenon and sort of didn't help a lot. And you get a dip there, and then you get recovery from that, and you're like, oh, now we're growing out. And then right about 1700, you get this just hockey stick up. It's actually quite profound if you look at it over a few millennia. It looks vertical. If you pull it out long enough, it looks like, okay, go back 10,000 years, and then all of a sudden it just population growth goes vertical. Where does that verticality come from? Well, this is, of course, debated like all things, but I would argue that one underappreciated element of this is because they say, oh, improvement in agricultural techniques. Absolutely true. Improvement in health, sanitation, and all this. Absolutely true. Improvement in communication and coordination of human society, deliveries of food, all this. Absolutely true. What makes all that possible? What makes it sustainable? What makes it communicable? It's literacy and the printing press. So now people are able to go, oh, you know what? I grew this crop and it grew really well. I'm going to write my buddy Ed, and Ed is going to be like, wow, that's great. I'm going to try that too. And then Ed's going to write somebody else. And then those people are going to go, you know what we should do? We should tell everybody. And now they can. So we're going to print up flyers, and these happened all. New agricultural techniques. We can print it up and we can send it out to 10,000 people, and those 10,000 people can tell another 100 people each. So now it's out to like a lot of people, and they're like, oh, we're going to try this new process for growing corn, and if that process increases corn production by 30%, like wow. Like that's massive. And so you get this feedback loop of knowledge, but it's knowledge that can be communicated and spread quickly and effectively. Never existed before. It was very difficult to get ideas to spread and to communicate them to enough people so that if the ship sinks, everybody who had this idea didn't die on the ship, because you just printed 1,000 flyers, or you printed 500 and mailed them out, or distributed them around, or all these communication systems that were made possible by this also meant that if no one read this for a while, somebody might read it in a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. It's still available. It's still capable of being referenced. And so you get this, just like I said, right around 1700, this just hockey stick vertical growth in human population. And that impact is largely, not exclusively, but largely driven by this incredible, profoundly transformative technology of the printing press combined with literacy. And that, basically global population boom. Like there's a billion and billion of us. Why? Because we got the printing press, we got literacy, we could communicate, and we started to have these, positive feedback loops that allow us to improve our lives and imagine better crops and imagine better ways of producing them. And then if it worked, to be able to communicate that. And so it's just a profound, and so it just woven in again like iron. It's just so embedded, and we take it so much for granted. But it's one of the, if not the single greatest transformative moment in the evolution of the primate into the human, because now it's the abstraction, it's the distance, it's the imagination that comes to the fore, for good and ill. But that's what it is, and now it unleashes and multiplies the power of the primate imagination, and that is the power of the printing press. Thank you very much.